In this video, we're going to be talking about the material library from inside of BobCAM for RHINO. Now, the material library can be found in a couple different places. The first place is on the top toolbar, on the BobCAM toolbar here. We have our material library button right there. You could also right-click on CAM defaults and go down to the material library. We also have the ability to expand the word stock. So if you've already started a milling job, a turning job, whatever job you've started, if you expand it, you have your material right here as well. So if I right-click on this material, I can say Edit. Now inside the materials, we have two kind of sections, the material group and the material list. The material group is all the different types of materials that we have. So alloy steel, aluminum, carbon steel, cast iron, copper alloy, magnesium, miscellaneous, which is where you're going to find brass and bronze and graphite, old cutting conditions, which is from our older system, plastics, stainless steel, super alloys, titanium, and tool steel. So we have all these different kind of categories, and in each category, we then have a list of all the available versions of that material. So if we look through aluminum, we have a pretty vast list of all different types of aluminums on this list. So you can go in and find the one that you want to select. So I'm going to go down here and say I have my 6061 T6. Now, if this is the material that I use the most often, what I could do is set that as my default. So I'm going to say set as default, so I have 6061 chosen because I do use that the most often. But you can also move to favorites. Now currently I don't have a favorites folder, and I'm not going to move my 6061 into there because then I'd lose it from this list. But if I use maybe a 6066, I could go right here and say move to favorites. And what it does is it creates a favorites folder and it puts it in there. So if you have 10 materials that you use often, you could go in and move all your materials that are pretty oftenly used over to your favorites folder, so you don't have to sort through the full list every time you're looking for your features. Now, another thing we have is the ability to add new groups. You'll notice there's no wood in here. If you're doing something with wood, most of the time it's because you're going to set up your own feeds and speeds, and those feeds and speeds don't change that much, so you probably won't set up a surface footage or a chip load per flute for wood. But if you wanted to, you could come in and say add a group, and I'll give that group the name of wood, and then I'll hit OK. Now, when we create that wood group, we then have an empty material list. So now over here, I can add a new material. So I could come in here and define, say maybe maple right there. And then we have our different settings. Now, every material that we have by default is going to have three settings: high-speed steel, carbide, and insert. And what this does, I'm just going to hit OK and go back to aluminum real quick. When I open up one of these that's already defined, we have our surface footage per minute, our surface footage while tapping, our chip load per flute, and our plunge chip load based on the material of the tool. So right here's my carbide settings. Right here's my insert settings. So we'll see it updates some information. And right here's my high-speed steel settings. So you can actually go in and redefine all of these values if you need to, based on what tool material you have while you're cutting that feature. You could even come in and customize specific feeds and speeds for when you're doing a rough cut with an end mill rough. Or if you're using an end mill finish and doing a rough cut, how do we adjust the feeds there? So I'm just going to uncheck that button and say, yes, I don't want to use those custom ones anymore. So you'll make sure you have your tool material selected. That's how we know which category to pull from, whether it's carbide, insert, or high-speed steel. If you need to modify these, this is where you're going to modify them. When you're all done, you can hit OK. And so there is the defined aluminum. Or if I went into wood here, I can open up that feature and I could add new materials in. So I could come in and say that I do want to use an insert cutter for this. And so I'll hit OK. And now I have my high-speed steel and then my insert. So I would have to come in, and I'm just going to use the same values we had for aluminum, and just type that in right there. And that's going to update the feature. So now if I have maple selected and I have an insert tool, we're going to automatically calculate the feed rates based on these values instead of the high-speed steel values. So you're going to make sure to set that up properly. The other part of this is you may not even use a tool library. If you use an external program like GWizard or some other program that basically gives you your feeds and speeds, and you're going to manually enter in those feeds and speeds, it doesn't really matter what material is selected. I would still always make sure to go in and set the right material so that when I generate my setup sheet and when I do my job, it does show up properly. I see it on my setup sheet. But if I'm manually entering in my feeds and speeds, it really doesn't matter what material I have selected because I'm not using BobCAM to create those materials. So I just set it to whatever I want. Otherwise, what I'm always going to do is set up my default. So I'm going to go to aluminum here. I'm going to scroll down to my 6061 T6, and I'm going to say set that as my default. And then when I hit OK, that's going to be the material that shows up under my stock. So if I delete this milling job, let's say yes, and I start a new milling job, and I expand stock, we'll see I now have 6061 as my default. So all the feed rates that I create and make from this job will automatically show up as if it's running with aluminum. Now, if you run a job as aluminum and you are letting BobCAM figure out the feeds and speeds, maybe you set it up for aluminum and then halfway through the job you realize you've made a mistake and that's supposed to be carbon steel. If you modify this, so if you go to edit, you go to your carbon steel down here, and I'm just going to choose some 1018 right there. This will retroactively change your feed rates as long as your feature is still using the system settings and you didn't come in and add custom settings. If you've added custom settings, we're going to use the custom settings every single time for the job. So that is our material library. And that concludes the video on the material library from inside of BobCAM for RHINO.